Hey everybody, it's Jen. Welcome back to the channel. I'm coming to you from a completely different place. I am in a hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona, and just about 2 miles down the road from where I'm sitting is my mom's assisted living facility. And this first video is what I hope will be one of a 4-part series where I'm going to go over the different aspects of what were the original things that made us know something was wrong, the very early signs of mom's dementia, the beginning of the story, the really hard decisions we had to make and how we did them. Things like taking away her car keys, convincing her to move to assisted living, things like that. In part 3, I'm going to talk about the challenges that we faced and the things that I have learned about how to best deal with my mom during this season of her life. And then in part 4, I'm going to go over things that have changed about my life personally that I'm doing differently in light of mom's diagnosis. Some lifestyle things, some diet things that I think are really, really important if we want to avoid Alzheimer's or any dementia and we want our brains to stay healthy as long as they possibly can. Before I get into part 1, I want to make it clear that I am not an expert on dementia or elderly care or anything even remotely close to it. And all I will be doing is sharing my story from my perspective. I will not be showing clips of my mom. My mom and I don't even have the same last name. Some of you, if you've been watching the channel for a while, my mom has absolutely been in my videos. She's still doing really, really well. But I just felt odd. And I just said something about this on social media. I felt like a bit of a hypocrite not showing you guys footage of her, because I have watched so many other people's YouTube videos where they've actually shown their parent in the throes of kind of a bad dementia day. And those videos were actually wildly helpful for me because you don't see a lot of that. You see a lot of like mass-produced videos for schools or to sell, I don't know, assisted living or long-term care insurance or whatever, but I thought about it. And to be quite honest, I think if I asked mom if she'd be willing to be on camera, she would probably say yes. But it did not feel right to me. It just felt kind of disloyal. It felt like a betrayal. Mom's image has always been very important to her. And so for the purposes of my channel, I've decided not to do that. But I am going to share my perspective as her child, as someone who is helping with the caregiving. Thank God I have my brother, my sister-in-law, my sister. There is a whole team of us working with her and for her. We call ourselves Operation Princess Barbara. We were calling ourselves Operation Queen Barbara, but she said she didn't like that. And I quote, because queens have to always know what to do and princesses just get taken care of. So sort of like, okay, Barbara, whatever you want to do. But one of the big questions that I had in the beginning, before she got a diagnosis, when we were kind of trying to figure out what was wrong and what to do about it, was what are some of the earliest signs? So for this video, that's what I wanted to go over. Mom was always very, very smart, very, very active. She was a docent for a local museum. She's been a Bible study teacher for decades now. Extremely sharp mind, always has had. And especially when it comes to technology, she's always been what I would call an early adapter. She's not a boomer. She's actually from the lost generation. She just turned 85 years old. And she took on to technology really easily. My dad worked for Honeywell when she first got her first computer. So we had a lot of computers around the house. She loved the computer. She loved that she could do research. She loved that it would help her with her presentations for the art museum. Has always loved technology. So I would say the very first thing that we noticed that something was awry was technology that she had always engaged with really well, her cell phone, her MacBook, those types of things. All of a sudden, she could not make sense of her own technology. She could not operate the phone. She couldn't operate her computer. And it was such a shift because she had always been able to manage all those things really, really well and really, really easily. So we were all a bit confused. She would say that her phone wasn't working all the time and her computer wasn't working. And she would pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to computer technicians to come out and look at her computer. And she would say, I don't know why they've changed everything. Everything's moved. Nothing's where I want it on my computer. My own son, who has a lot of experience in IT, was out there with her. This was really early on. And his comment was, I don't understand why I show her something I know she's done a million times, and then 5 minutes later, she can't do it. So I would say that those signs started showing up a good 5 to 6 years ago, a long time ago. And we all just kind of dismissed it. In hindsight, if I could go back in time, I wish we had gotten a baseline cognitive assessment then. But she also was starting to notice something was wrong. And the reason I know that's true is because when we would try to help her or correct her, she would get very impatient with herself. She would get very angry with us. And it just wasn't like her. So that was probably the very first thing we noticed. So that went on for a couple of years where she just kind of was getting by. There were a lot of communication issues because her phone would never work. She couldn't figure out how to get her phone to open up, to look at messages, just really, really basic stuff that she'd always been able to do. We went through like 4 cell phones because she was convinced that it was Apple's fault and the cell phones just didn't work. And again, this is in hindsight, right? So looking back, we just thought, oh, she's just getting a little older. But now that I'm on the other side of it, I have come to find out it's one thing for an older person to just struggle with technology. It's a completely different scenario for them to have technology that has always come very easily to them suddenly seem very foreign, very confusing, and just like even like her television, couldn't get her cable box to work, couldn't figure out we were at her house, we got her a new TV, we went over the instructions on how to get to her channels over and over and over again. She could not figure it out. So those sorts of things. Couple of years of really just the technology issues. There weren't really any other telltale signs. The second thing that I started to notice was her inability to carry on a two-sided conversation. She seemed to be getting more and more selfish as time went on. Like there was no give and take in conversations with her. So, we're taught when we're really young, when you have a conversation with someone, I mean, unless you're a YouTube creator and then you just talk, you throw the ball and they throw the ball back. You almost couldn't have a conversation with her because anything that you tried to talk about yourself, she would bring back to herself, and she would just kind of just go on and on and on and on and on like a runaway train. You couldn't get a word in edgewise. Nothing that you contributed to the conversation was seemingly heard or understood. And I'll admit, for a long time, I just thought she was being very, very selfish, and it was making me very frustrated. And I kind of stopped calling her as often as I had for a good amount of time. This went on for a good while. We were all kind of noticing it, noticing that she would repeat the same stories over and over again, but not just in a way that you do. I repeat the same stories. I've repeated the same stories on my channel, but in a way that she didn't seem to know when the stories happened. It wasn't like when someone shares a story of something interesting that happened to them years ago and they like the story and they like telling it. So you're like, yeah, I'd love to hear that. She would share a story in a timeline like it had happened last week, when it was something that had happened many weeks or months before. She would get upset about an interaction that had happened, say, at a grocery store, or on the flip side, something good that had happened, say, at the grocery store many, many weeks or months before, and she would tell the story as though it had just happened. So we started noticing some space-time continuum, if you're a Star Trek fan, issues. She wasn't able to kind of exist in current time and space. Conversations were almost impossible to have. And if you brought her attention to it, she would get very, very angry. The other thing we started noticing is she was getting lost a lot. And in part 2 of this series, I'm going to tell you the story about how we actually ended up taking her car keys away. That was probably the first most stressful thing that we went through. There's been more stressful things since, and we're still not through it, by the way. As I'm sitting here, we still have not done the estate sale. We still have not sold her home. We still have not done all that, but she is settled somewhat happily in assisted living. There was one instance where she drove down a street that was under construction, and the tar was still wet on the pavement, and she caused a ton of damage to her vehicle. And she said the signage was bad. There was more and more things happening in a driving perspective, that we were getting very, very concerned about her driving. My sister, my niece that lives at the time where she was living, were being very helpful of trying to drive her places. This was also when we noticed she was really struggling to manage her finances. There were some missed bills, things like that. My brother stepped in at that point. He offered, it's very important you tell this story right. He offered to help her with her finances, and she took him up on it. If you were ever to say that it was his idea, she gets very, very upset. So you always have to be clear to say that he offered to help with her finances. And at this point, my brother John really stepped up to the plate. He became her medical power of attorney. He had her DNR done. He became her power of attorney for all of her bills. Spent several days at her house putting all those things into place, visiting the banks, getting everything in order, putting his name on all of her checking accounts. Of course, with the blessing of my sister and myself, because we all knew that we didn't know at the time that she had dementia, but we knew that mom was no longer going to be able to care for her own finances, and that this was really important, that this really needed to happen. The diagnostic part, once we started seeing how bad it was, particularly with the bill paying and things like that, we really wanted her to have a cognitive assessment. Her doctor at the time really wanted her to do that. All of us were rooting for it. The problem was, at this phase, mom was still very, very independent in every way. She could make phone calls. At one point, she got suspicious of all of us that we were going to try to take her car away, so she had the locks changed on her house. She was very capable. And even as I'm sitting here now, she's still very capable, albeit it's starting to lessen a little, which has enabled us to put the important things into place that needed to happen for her safety. Having her get diagnosed took about 18 months longer than it should have, simply because we could not convince her to go. Had I known then what I know now, which is really the main impetus for me making these videos in the first place, I would have just taken her. We were doing way too much asking and not enough just doing. Had I just shown up at her door and said, remember, we have that appointment we have to go to, and if I had just driven her to the appointment, we would have been much better off. Ultimately, she ended up having to have the assessment because she ended up in the emergency room because she was having a particularly bad night. One thing that they tell you early on when you have someone that you love that's elderly of any type is that their bowels and their bladder are their second and third brain. So anytime something is going on with their bowels and their bladder, their brain and their dementia will be a million times worse. So mom ended up in the emergency room with some really bad bowel problems that were making her act not like herself at all, to the point where we were worried she had had a stroke. She ended up in the ER, and all of the tests were run, including a CT scan, including a baseline cognitive exam, which then led us to being in a primary care doctor's office. That then led us to a palliative care specialist who specializes in dementia, and doing a full workup on her. We opted not to do, there is a 3-hour assessment you can do. When we went in for the original assessment, which was about, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes, the nurse practitioner that we saw felt that she had enough evidence with the CT scan, with everything that had been done at the ER, and with the cognitive assessment that she had, to give mom a diagnosis of dementia, most likely a mixture of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. Vascular dementia is usually something that happens with people with heart problems, prior strokes. Mom has AFib, so there can be a lot of contributing factors. Vascular dementia tends to, and again, I'm not an expert, this is just what I've learned and put in my little noggin. Vascular dementia does tend to progress quite a bit more quickly than Alzheimer's dementia, but I'm going to get more into that when I get into the segment about what we learned. So what I would say, and I think this is really true, and I hope I will find this to be true of myself as well. If you suspect cognitive decline of any type, any shape, form, or fashion, going in and getting a baseline cognitive assessment is the best bet. It is the best thing you can do. And cognitive assessments are a little tricky, right? Because they can't compare you to you. They're comparing you to the average of everyone else that has taken the cognitive assessment. So in mom's case, and she's extremely bright and extremely educated. So it's quite possible that without a baseline cognitive assessment, say from 5 or 10 years ago, you might do an assessment on her, I don't know, maybe 3, 4 years ago and thought, oh, well, she's perfectly fine because she's within the parameters of the average. If you do a baseline cognitive assessment, which I'm sitting here at the age of 54, I intend to do with the next 5 or 6 years, then you have something to compare it to. Then you can go in and just have that be a regular course of things that you do. Now, whether or not that is going to be covered by insurance is an entirely different thing. Don't even get me started on that. Anyone that has walked this road with a parent knows that it is shocking what Medicare doesn't pay for. It is shocking how little you have to be able to qualify for Medicaid, the whole Medicaid spend down thing. There's a lot to it. And the care is ridiculously expensive. And as always, if you're very wealthy in this country, you're fine. But the rest of us are kind of hosed. So it's a really bad system. We treat our elderly really poorly in the United States. And I will tell you, it has taken myself, my brother, my sister, and my sister-in-law all doing our own different pieces of this to get us where we are now. And sitting here now, I can tell you that this journey really started about 5 years ago. Now, as far as prognosis is concerned, the average life expectancy for someone diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia is, I believe, 7 years from diagnosis. Vascular dementia, it's like 3 to 5 years from diagnosis. Mom is in really good physical health. But in the next video, I'm going to get into the signs and symptoms that led us to realize that she could not live alone anymore. And then the journey of getting her to agree that she couldn't live alone anymore. And also how we did things like getting the car keys away and things like that. So if you are going through this right now, I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found it encouraging. I hope you know that you're not only not alone, you are one of millions of children right now in the United States, or spouses or best friends or partners or siblings that are walking this road with someone that they love. It is the hardest road I have ever been on. And we're still not done yet, but I did want to come on here and use what I have, which is my voice here on YouTube, to talk about it, to kind of demystify it, and to hopefully just give some insight and most of all, some encouragement. So yeah, meet me here at some point for part 2.